assistant of Creative Ireland, in particular Tanya Benotti and John Knightley, who's been our contact with Creative Ireland. So I can't thank them enough. Creative Ireland are also going to be funding the publication of the work of the two Peters in the Civic Trust, Peter Tina and Peter Walsh. Or Peter, I'm not sure about the second surname, but the thing is, for the Peters and for the Civic Trust, it is vital. If those demolitions of historic fabric are to stop, that publication has to come out next year. There is no point in leaving it for another year or another day or another minute. It's already kind of 5 minutes to midnight, so that publication is vital because it tracks the historic fabric in our city, which is here and it's all around us, and the Peters have documented it. We just need to get that document published. In relation to the talks this morning, I just want to say one thing. Neil Crimond deserves a sainthood, a PhD, I don't know what, for the quality of his research. It's extraordinary. I said it to Neil before lunch. Absolutely extraordinary. That's hard as an archaeologist, talking to an architect. So I'd like to introduce you to Colin. The two chairs today are going to be Colin Murray from the Heritage Council and Mary MacDonald from DCC. Mary, Dublin City Council are lucky to have somebody like Mary. Mary's experience is really extensive. She's an RIA Grade 1 accredited conservation architect. She graduated from UCD School of Architecture, and she worked on a number of projects in London, Edinburgh and St. Petersburg before returning to Dublin in 1997. Following a year with Horan Keoghan Ryan Architects, Mary joined Building Design Partnership in Dublin to work as a project architect on the award-winning Fingal County Council designed building by Buchholz McAvoy Architects. Upon obtaining a Master's in Urban and Building Conservation in UCD in 2004, Mary joined Paul Arnold Architects, a Grade 1 conservation practice, working on a wide range of historic buildings and protected structures throughout the country for private, public and institutional clients. Mary joined DCC in November 2017 and is currently acting as a Senior Executive Architectural Conservation Officer with the Dublin City Council. Personally, she's been a friend since we were 17 and I know her integrity, I know her standards, I know her utter commitment to buildings and to the historic conservation. So I'll be handing you first to Mary. Colin, on the other hand, I'll just introduce you to Colin. You all know Colin, if I can find his introduction. Colin Murray is an architect who's working with the Heritage Council. But Colin didn't always work with the Heritage Council. Colin, I know, worked for some time with our department, and in fact he was very, very important in the writing of the draft framework guidelines for architectural conservation. Then Colin went to work with the OPW for a while, and then he found his most recent home with the Heritage Council in Kilkenny. Colin, I'm really sorry, I can't find your bio, so it's all off the top of your head. But you know, we all know the work that the Heritage Council does in publicising, in bringing communities together, and in funding so many projects countrywide. So that's my bit.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Nikki, for inviting me to chair this session. It's a great privilege, and it's wonderful to be in Dublin Civic Trust's wonderful offices. I'm going to introduce Dr. John Knightley. He works with Creative Ireland, which is led by Tanya Benotti. Creative Ireland is part of the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, and John has a PhD in the evolution of country houses and domains in Kerry, and a Master's in landscape conservation from Bath University. In his work with the Built Heritage section, he champions the built heritage. And I'd like to welcome Dr. John Knightley. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, guests, distinguished guests. It's been a very interesting morning to hear all the conversations so far. I will not keep you too long. Firstly, I would like to say how delighted we were in the Creative Ireland Programme Office to be able to support the symposium today. When our colleagues in the heritage side of the house approached us about this some months ago, we instantly recognised an opportunity here to partner with them partnering with them and indeed the Dublin Civic Trust in delivering this exciting agenda today. The whole issue of raising awareness and seeking innovative and creative solutions to regenerate our towns and villages is an issue that affects communities across the country. Closely allied to this is the whole concept of well-being and increasing awareness of how our surroundings affect our health and lifestyles, whether through climate change or simply valuing what we have, our built heritage, our natural and design landscapes, our biodiversity. It's a discussion where we feel the Creative Ireland programme has a role to play. And certainly coming here today and supporting this is part of raising awareness about this very important topic. For those of you who do not know what the programme is about, I would therefore like to take this opportunity to give you the briefest of introductions. And as I say, it will be slightly divergent on what we heard this morning. What is the Creative Ireland programme? Well, the Creative Ireland programme is a 5-year all-of-government programme, 2017-2022, which aims to place creativity at the heart of public discourse. What this effectively means is that it aims to support as much participation as possible in cultural and creative activities that promote the individual, community and national well-being. It is emphatically not an arts programme, but encompasses a wide range of different topics, including architecture, heritage, history, conservation, as well as the usual suspects like drama, theatre, arts, visual arts, and so on. As originally conceived, it was based on 5 pillars, which you can see here on the screen. In reality, Pillar 3, Culture and Creative Infrastructure, has evolved to become Project 2040, the major capital programme being led by the government. Pillar 5 then has evolved to become Global Ireland, which is led by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So therefore, when we talk about Creative Ireland in terms of the department, we're talking about really pillars 1, 2 and 4. And the subject of the symposium today, from what I've heard this morning, covers all these different areas. But fundamentally, we in the Creative Ireland Programme Office would see the discussion today as fundamentally resting under Pillar 2, the whole idea of creative communities. What do we mean by creative communities? Well, primarily this pillar is supported and delivered through the local authorities, with funding from the Creative Ireland programme. We give them approximately up to 4 million a year. Amongst all 31 local authorities, that's roughly 120,000–130,000 each, to deliver and support an annual programme of events and initiatives. This might not seem like much money, but it is extraordinary what can be achieved with such a modest amount of funding. To date, over the last 3 years, we have supported and funded 3,500 projects across the country, of which 60 or so are directly related to the topics that we are discussing here today: architecture, conservation, regeneration. To give you some examples of the types of projects we have supported, this slide here shows a promo for Architecture Kerry 2019, one particularly dear to my own heart because that's where I'm from. It's a local open house festival, now in its 2nd year, which is proving hugely popular, where the public are getting access to buildings ordinarily off limits. This project is led by Victoria McCarthy, the Conservation Officer for Kerry, and that is one of the things we're trying to do in Creative Ireland, is to break down the silos, not only within our own department, but also in the local authorities themselves, between, say, the Arts Division, the Heritage Division, the Library Division, and get them to work on a cross-sectoral basis. And this project is a very good example of that. So Creative Kerry is led by the Arts Officer, but Victoria delivers in this particular aspect of it. I should add here that the discretion of what local authorities fund is entirely up to themselves. We don't have any major role in that in terms of the Dublin office. Turning to some other examples of projects we have funded, this one here is one that we funded this year in Tipperary, through Tipperary County Council, a geophysical survey of Lochmoe Castle, which has enabled the production of this rather interesting drawing, a visual reconstruction of what it may have looked like in the landscape, with its bawn walls, fish ponds, outbuildings and other features. A final report on this tower house / Renaissance mansion is due to be published, I understand, next year. Fundamentally, however, this project, aside from its archaeological value, was about the local community wanting to know what comprised their own local heritage. And that, I think, is one of the key things we're trying to do in the Creative Ireland programme. Another project that might be of specific interest to you today is the Connect to the Grid project in Limerick City, which has been led by Tom Cassidy, the Conservation Officer, who I believe was here earlier, or still here. Its main focus is regeneration, conservation and reuse. And Tom kindly gave me these two photographs yesterday of number 68 O'Connell Street, which has been the focus of, as you can see, a major rewigging project. And the before and after photographs speak for themselves, and it's a remarkable rejuvenation of this 18th century facade. Moving northward, and I saw the thatch and the vernacular architecture was mentioned earlier. Donegal County Council, for instance, used some of our funding to support their A Stitch in Time thatching grant scheme. And this additional support from Creative Ireland enabled these particular buildings to be conserved and rethatched in the last 2 years. On the left is a thatched house from Clonmany, on the right is one from Stravoy. One might say, what does creativity have to do with thatch? But fundamentally for us, it's about placemaking, sense of place, pride in place, with obvious benefits locally and to the wider community. Another project that was also accomplished with support from Creative Ireland in 2018 was the conservation of Gloucester Arch in County Offaly. And this remarkable folly, which as you know was probably conceived and built by Pearse to terminate a vista from the main house, is an important structure of national importance. And the Creative Ireland programme was one of 5 sources of funding that was drawn upon to support the rejuvenation of this extraordinary structure, led by Chris Southgate. The work involved, as you can see, extensive root treatment, lime mortar repairs, and restoration of various elements. Again, aside from the visual and architectural importance of this, Gloucester House itself is an important local resource and, of course, an important economic driver in that community in Offaly. We continued that relationship with Offaly County Council this year when we teamed up with them to fund works to Ballycumber Folly, a very interesting belvedere which we think was built in the early 19th century. Like Gloucester, it too is an important eye-catcher sitting in an important domain landscape. Fundamentally, however, this is also important to the local community, particularly in terms of tidy towns. And it was the Tidy Towns Committee that really pushed for this to be conserved and restored, because it can be seen along a river walk. Conservation works here were undertaken by Clancy and Partners and involved the removal of vegetation, consolidation of the structure, repointing and buttress repair, and you can see clearly reconstruction. And the before and after photographs, I think, again, tell their own story. Particularly important here in terms of Offaly is the relationship we in the Creative Ireland Programme Office have built up with Amanda Pedlow, the Heritage Officer for Offaly, and Rachel McKenna, the Conservation Officer. Amanda also happens to be the Creative Ireland Coordinator for Offaly. So each county has a Creative Ireland officer. Sometimes they're the Heritage Officer, sometimes they're the Arts Officer. They're a key go-to person within each county. My message to you today really is for any of you involved in projects with local authorities, I would strongly encourage you to contact the local Creative Ireland coordinator in your respective county to discuss possible support and funding for surveys and conservation works. I think, as I say, there's a perception the Creative Ireland programme is an arts programme. It's not. It crosses a much wider ambit, as you can see by these projects. Aside from the county councils, we have also entered into some strategic partnerships across the culture sector, looking at the whole issues of creativity, community and placemaking. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Heritage Council over the last few years. Another exciting project that we've entered into this year, is an exciting partnership with the Irish Architecture Foundation, led by Natalie Wiedek, who I believe is here today, yes, entitled Reimagine. And this fundamentally is about developing processes that give communities a voice in how better to connect people and places, using conversations, workshops, and design and architectural strategies. Basically ensuring all voices are heard, which I think we might all agree should be a fundamental consideration in how we approach our built environment. As you can see from the list here, pilot projects have been rolled out in a variety of locations in 2018, and we hope to engage further with the IAF in 2020 to further develop this project. Finally, another project that we have recently entered into a partnership with is with the Historic Houses of Ireland to further deliver on some of the actions contained in the action plan which was published by our department in 2015. This particular project, which is called Creative Reappraisal, is going to look at the country house from an entirely different perspective, not heritage, not architecture, nor indeed as a relic of a stranded gentry, but rather as potential drivers or engines of creativity in rural Ireland, particularly focusing on the opportunities that the country house may offer to communities, to children in terms of education, and also as economic and social spaces. There are, as you might be aware, a lot of unused stables and courtyards around the country. This project is in its infancy, so it'll be exciting to see how it develops over the next year. We're also, of course, delighted, and my colleagues referred to this earlier, to be able to support, in relation to this particular event today, two forthcoming publications, one in the RIAI on the reuse and adaptation of historic buildings, and the other on the Dutch Billy tradition in Dublin. So we're particularly pleased about that. As I said at the start, this was an opportunity to give you a brief oversight of the Creative Ireland programme. And while I cannot speak to the specific topics being discussed here today, the examples that I've shown you and the general ethos of Creative Ireland reflect common themes that have been expressed here today. Cultural layering, urban life, living cities and spaces, creating places, regeneration, renewal, adaptation. They are all subjects we all have in common. Fundamentally for the programme, and for us in the programme, it goes back to communities, to people, to our surroundings, our quality of life, our well-being, our past, our present, our future. So let me conclude by saying that I do hope that we can continue this important conversation and this partnership. And as I say, we would always welcome anybody who comes to us with ideas on how better to explore and raise awareness of this extremely important topic. Thank you very much.
I forgot to mention that I'm supposed to be ruthless on timekeeping, so I'm going to amend my ways. Our next speaker is Dr. Freddie O'Dwyer. He's a Grade 1 conservation architect, architectural historian and town planner. He was employed in the public service between 1981 and 2017, latterly in the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. He's the author of 3 books: Lost Dublin in 1981, The Architecture of Dean and Woodward, and Irish Hospital Architecture, A Pictorial History, both in 1997, and numerous articles. He completed a PhD in Architectural History at Trinity College Dublin in 1995 and an MSc in Spatial Planning in DIT in 2010, with a thesis on the protection of upstanding monuments in Britain and Ireland since 1845. His most recent essays, both in 2019, are The Conservation Ethics of Reconstruction, Challenges for the Planning Process, and Anticipating Ruskin, The Innovative Architectural Conservation in Mid-Victorian Ireland. So I'd like to welcome Freddie for this. Thank you very much.
I've just changed the title of the paper slightly, insofar as it says characteristics of building elements, structural carpentry and joinery, rather than putting the building elements last, because there's been a bit of a movable feast this lecture, because I was trying to not to duplicate, as Nicky had other speakers coming in and going out, and duplicate what other people were doing. So in fact, it also, I thought it was more useful to be talking about the actual physical buildings as you see them, rather than getting into and then do the details as we get into them. So because most people see them from the outside, well, obviously see them from the outside in the first instance. And my former colleague John Knightley had actually the first same slide as I had, so it wasn't a conspiracy. But I will say that I just have to say at the start that, as John said, I think if I'm quoting correctly, is that he wasn't going to talk about specific cases. Is that because all structures pre-1700 are protected under the National Monuments Act as historic monuments, some of the buildings I'll be showing you were obviously ones where I was acting as an agent of the department, so I'm not going to be covering detail on processes involved in those. But in any case, the first slide, which it's from McParlin's book on public architecture, but it's a drawing attributed to Pearse, which he doesn't think is by Pearse. But anyway, we don't know who it's by. But it's just interesting in that it shows three styles of building, and this is just one of my themes, just different styles of building, because I'm talking to people over the last couple of weeks, including some of the people who've been involved in restoration of 17th century buildings in Dublin. It was quite clear this whole issue was coming about was there more than one type building? In other words, we know there was a certain type in industry, we know there were Dutch billies, were they being built at the same time? Now Peter Kernhan has covered a lot of that ground this morning, so I'm not going to, I intend to do is to supplement it. But this picture in fact does actually sort of demonstrate that. In other words, you've got three styles here. You've got the Parliament building of the 1720s by Pearse, which is classical, in fact, almost sort of almost neoclassical, it's so advanced. You've got the Dutch buildings on both sides, but also on the right you've got Sir Hiram Alexander's building, which is the west front of Trinity College. And it has a Baroque gable. At that time only one half of it was built, which was half built by Charles Lucas in 1672, but in fact you can actually see that it actually has a scrolled pediment on it, so this is actually a Baroque feature. The next slide shows it as completed in 1699 by Sir William Robinson, the Surveyor General, and this can clearly be seen if you look at the centrepiece, which is Robinson's, and the bit to the right is all in the Baroque style. So while we associate Robinson with being a Renaissance classicist insofar as his work in the Royal Hospital, Dublin Castle and so on, he was also working in the Baroque style. So the important thing is not only were there more than one type of building being built in a domestic scale in Dublin at the time, but even as far as public buildings there were different styles being used. And even an architect like Robinson, who were associated with classicism, was working different styles. This idea of the scroll pediment is actually taken from Serlio and published in Serlio's books of the mid-16th century. Just here some of Serlio's plates from his books on stage designs, but you can actually see here he's mixed up all different architectural styles. So you've got Gothic and Classical, and even his own Serlian scrolls. When talking about the origins of gabled houses, very interesting, Peter has covered some of the ground this morning, but it was the problem I kind of set myself was, when did gabled houses begin and end? And in writing Lost Dublin, which he wrote 40 years ago, which Peter Wallace was very helpful on, I was asking him, and he basically, as I quoted him from his article in the Liberties of Dublin in 1973, said really that the sort of precedents for the southwest England. Whereas at the same time, Maurice Craig, who I talked to 40 years ago, said, oh no, he said the origins are in the Holborn gables, and I didn't know what Holborn gables was. I thought he was talking about tobacco, you see. And these actually survive on the left, but they're actually 16th century, half timbered. But I didn't know what he was talking about until I came to prepare this lecture, because I said, what were the Holborn gables? And I'll show you now. But anyway, the first building with this sort of scrolled pediments and so on is, I think, major British building is Montacute House in Somerset, 1598. So that's the start of the gables. But these are the Holborn gables that Morris was talking about 40 years ago. And I had the book that they were in, which was an exhibition catalogue for the V&A from the 1970s. And there's a house called Sir Fulk Greville's house in the Strand in London, which we know is pre-1619 because the drawing on the left is 1619 by Spitzel, and the drawing on the right is by Inigo Jones. But the problem really why it hasn't been written up, as I discovered, is because Sir John Summerson and Sir Howard Colvin could never agree as to whether the same or different houses, and John Harris sided with Summerson. There was just a complete blank, so nobody ever wrote about it except to knock off the other, to criticise the other person's view. So they've never been fully investigated. But I'm saying now, the one on the right may not be the same house, but it is, as Morris says, the first evidence we have of a gabled pediment. Jones, at the same time, was working for the kings, the first James II, and after his death in 1625, son Charles I. And he was working on doing a different style, in other words, more uniform style. Jones had been to Italy 3 times, been to France, very well travelled, and he wanted to build sort of Italian-style piazzas like you've seen in Livorno, and you can see the gabled houses in the back and on the left. So rather like what we were shown earlier about the Droghada's Mall with the gabled houses, a thing of the past, you can see Inigo Jones doing the same thing a century earlier. Jones also did a scheme for Lincoln's Inn Fields, of which only part was built. So we don't know whether he built this as Lindsay House from the 1630s. But just to show what can happen to buildings, this is research in the 1620s ceiling in Bristol, which existed up until 2 years ago. Right there it is in a bar and in a non-prepossessing building. And I just found this on the internet when I was looking for stuff. And the reason why it became noteworthy is that English Heritage got a tip off that it was going to be demolished, and they made an appointment with the developer to meet him on a Thursday, themselves the local authority, and on the Wednesday sent a crew in and they took it down. And but I just showed you the type of construction which is on the slide on the left, which you can see is what I'll be talking about, which is about the major beams or breastments. The binder beams are, in this case you've got separate ceiling joists and floor joists, and relating to the Dublin structures. Half timber. When did half timber begin and end? I didn't know. I have the answer now. When he got it this week, these are the last half timbered structures to be built in Britain, and they were built in the 1650s in Newcastle. And there's a complete terrace. Even the houses with brick fronts were originally half timbered as well in Sound Hill in Newcastle. And the reason why they're half timbered, and I finally got the article yesterday to look it up in Trinity electronically, is that the people who built them are all Puritans, and they regarded what Inigo Jones had been doing for the monarchs as being as royalty, and they were Puritans because Newcastle was tied with Cromwell. So when they redeveloped this area, and they were all members of the same Puritan sect, they redeveloped it as half-timbered houses. One of them is 1657. The one on this one on the right-hand side was restored by the later Viscount Gort, and in the 1930s he put all his own furniture into it, which is all now in Bunratty. He must have had a row with people in Newcastle subsequently. But and anyway, if you look up that website, half-timbered houses, cagework house, Peter's already covered that. Curvilinear gables, this is from Peter Walsh's book on the right-hand side. You had different types, one with a flat top, one with a curvilinear top, and then you had mansions. I think somebody showed one earlier with which was Lord Clancarty's mansion in College Green. This is one of us in Moleswood Street on the left. Similar dome kiss of what was Turvey House with the gables filled in. So in other words, people were still, even wealthy people, putting in gables on houses. But on the other hand, there was a separate style and operation. On the left is Belvedere, now part of St Patrick's Training College, which I first visited with Geraldine Stout, who was here many years ago, and who got me into it. And it's 1680s, so it's obviously not in a gable style, it's the classical style. But the roof was changed in the 1720s and was probably more like the house on the right, which is Elton Lodge of the 1660s outside London. And these are the interiors, and this is the panelling of Belvedere, which is 17th century. I think only the complete 17th century panelling in Dublin, and you can see the downstone beam. The most important house probably of the period was also the 1680s, and we don't know what it looked like. It was Speaker Connolly's house, which he bought, but we don't know who he bought it from. It was built in the 1680s. It was replaced in the 1770s by a row of buildings, and one of them was demolished, and we found, the only trace we could find, in fact, was we found an imprint of all the coin stones on the adjoining building, which was built later. On the right-hand side then, you can see at the corner of Riders Row, when I was researching this in the 1990s, Mary Clark was able to produce deeds she had for houses in Capel Street, Riders Row, which was 1680, 88, and then when we got into those eventually, got in with Leicester Roach, we discovered that they had 17th century interiors. Unfortunately, at that stage they'd got into a dangerous condition, and after we took the slides, these are Nessa's slides, the building went on fire one weekend and it was all lost. This is the only record of the interior. So to deal with, I suppose, the official style then, which is, they're all Renaissance, they're all classical, but are they all the same? Because these two buildings are a century apart. On the left-hand side you have the Antwerp Town Hall, which is dating from the 1560s. It was rebuilt after a fire, delivered fire by the Spanish in the 1560s. And then on the right-hand side you have Amsterdam Royal Palace, which is of the 1640s. And they're both in Renaissance classical style, but they look totally different style, even though they're variations of the same style. And the reason is that the one on the left is very Baroque, the one on the right is more classical. You've got the same happening in Dublin. You've got William Robinson using classical work for Dublin Castle on the left and in the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham. It's not particularly Baroque. The tower is interesting, but the tower is later, it's by Colin Spur. If you look at that opening there into the belfry, you can actually see a very interesting combination of a circle and two round arches, which I'll come back to in a minute, because a round arch style was the 17th century style. They get away from Gothic. But here you have Robinson in 1680s, the Royal Hospital, using Gothic revival, which is still being used, Gothic style on the Royal Hospital, and on the right he's using Baroque 20 years later in St Mary's Church. So Robinson's working in three styles. The origin of that window I showed you in the Royal Hospital of 1710 or thereabouts is this important building on the left, which is the Westerkerk in Amsterdam, 1620 to 31 by de Keyser, which is probably the first really of Romanesque sort of style. It's not a Gothic style church. It's the largest Protestant church in Europe because it's built after the Reformation by the Dutch government, and it had an influence in Ireland. This is from Kevin Mulligan's book on the right, the church in Killashandra of 1688. So you can see we're getting ideas here from Holland, and a lot of these appearing in churches in Ireland. Now, to look at the frames, on the left, Royal Hospital, which is all a plain frame, no trusses. On the right, by Robinson. Below is Kilmacurra, also attributable to Robinson, no trusses. On the right, we have Thomas Burr, with trusses in the Royal, in the Dr. Stephen's Hospital. Now, I was talking to Tom McGimsey during the week, and he was saying years ago he got a lecture from Arthur Gibney, and Arthur Gibney said no, they didn't use trusses at the time, and that's true. Probably in the 17th century you don't find many trusses, but in the early 18th century you do. But I'm not sure what the floors were like in Kilmacurra, whether there were downstand beams or not, but downstand beams are typical of this period up until the early 18th century. And then the staircases, we had some discussion of that earlier, but you go from the low balustrade of the 17th century Royal Hospital on the left to Kilmacurra by the same architect 20 years later, and this is one of Nessa's slides, and you can see a more vertical type of baluster. On the other hand, there were siltstone downstand beams being used in the early 18th century. Doskiddy's Almshouses and Dr. Stephen's Hospital on the right, both of the 1710s. Gabled houses. If you Google gabled houses, you don't find Dublin. Dutch gables. You Google Dutch gables in Wikipedia, this is what you get, which is Arras in France, which is a marvellous ensemble in two squares, damaged in the First World War. Interesting though, because this slide actually shows you when after shell fire, when the front walls collapse, you can actually see the construction. And the reason why the houses were this width, and presumably the reason why Burgess plots were the width they are, is that is the width that an oak beam could span. And if you look on the right hand slide, you can actually see an enlargement of that with the beams, and you can see the mortises and the beams. There's an English example here from downstand beams, an example in Clare. This is Grand Shaftry's building in Ormond Quay, where it was later changed. This is Aylwardstown, which is a fortified house in County Kilkenny, and you can see just one big beam in the centre. Temple Oak House, still surviving. Gabled houses I will fly through because Peter has covered them already, so you know the details of those. This is Arthur's drawings, how they were constructed. Some of them, roof timbers had purlins. 18th century, the type of timbers you come in are more vertical timbers. And but on the hand, you have a combination. This is Lombardstown House, which burnt in 2012, which we were told, assured was 18th century, but yet there were beams of an earlier period, and you can see the 17th century house hidden behind it. And to go on to Ainger Street then, this is really the greatest concentration. We first registered number 21 in 1992. Subsequently, after UCD, students had done a survey, they found more streets, and we registered those later on. So there's 9, 10, 20, 19 and 20 and 21 are registered monuments. Peter's covered these already. These are, I think, early 18th century Ainger Street interventions. But then, this is important because the photo slide on the right, taken by Aidan Lumley of Ainger Street, sent to the OPW, where we were at the time, said that he'd taken this photograph of number 21, and it was the same as the Georgian Society earlier. And on that basis, we both appealed, planning permission granted by DCC, respecting the building, to the board and registered as a monument. So that was the first one to be registered. That's it on the left, as restored by Dublin Civic Trust. On the right, 19 to 20, which Richard McLaughlin is working on, but you have to start. Richard's given me some slides of showing the construction. You can see the big beams and small joists. 9 and 9A, 10 and 10A, all registered in the 1990s. 9 and 9A was the subject of Tom's slides, and we'll come to that in a minute. On 10 and 10A, there was a lot of work done in the 1990s, and these are the backs, and I'll just show you a detail of 10 and 10A from slides I took 20 years ago, where it actually had a pair of pilasters, and this is just my scale on some of the cornice work, which was timber. And Tom's sections showing how these were brick buildings built really like what Inigo Jones was doing in the 1830s. In other words, this is after the restoration in 1600. When people started rebuilding both in London and Dublin, they wanted to go back to what they were doing in the 1730s and build uniform linear streets with gables with ridges parallel to the street. So this is why Angel Street is not a gabled street. It's going back to a street pattern which had been started by Jones before the British, before Commons time. These are just some details of 9 and 9A. Now, Tom was saying they thought that the top flight, which has barley sugar balusters, is later than the one on the left, which is the same as actually number 10. But I found last night, this is a house which actually Richard had, houses in House of Interest. I just found this on the internet, a house in London of the same period, and it showed you that there were 4 different types of handrail used. So just to wrap up with 9 and 9A, this is during consolidation works done a couple of years ago with Lisa Edna's conservation engineer, where they had to basically jack up the stairs and major works and put temporary steels in. This is a slide showing 2 types of construction. One on the left, which is very interesting because it actually shows not the small floor joists which we expect from the 17th century, but full depth ones, which I didn't know about. And Tom said the reason we use full depths is that there's actually a ceiling under it. And this is, and the one on the right then shows the stud work on the stairs. This is the repairs which Tom has done, Lisa had done to the roof, and you can see it's a framed roof, rather like the Royal Hospital, not a truss as such. And you can see the way that the 2 principal members, there are a pair of principals, and then the others are rafters, but you can see that the way that they're mortise and tenons, no nails. And this is one which you won't have seen before, which I took in 1996 of the same space when it was occupied. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Freddie. That was amazing. Bang on the button. Our next speaker is David Averill. He is a director at Sheen Barry Architects, Grade 1 Conservation Architects. And he has been working with Sheen and Barry since late 1986. He's worked on a number of significant conservation projects such as Newman House, 85, 86 St Stephen's Green, Dublin 2, Giltown Stud, County Kildare, 8 Stephen's Green, 58 Merrion Square, Rusborough House in County Wicklow, Lambay Island, and numerous other large and small projects during his time at Sheen Barry. He holds individual conservation accreditation grade 2, and he has developed a particular interest in the conservation of buildings, as well as how buildings can be sensitively added to or updated where required. He has a particular interest in the work of Sir Edwin Lutyens and has travelled extensively with the Lutyens Trust to visit various works in the UK, France and the USA. And he's going to speak about number 130 Thomas Street, which Thomas Street is featuring a lot today. Thank you, David.
I'm going to set my stopwatch so I can be good at this. Now, so just to kind of give you the background to 130 Thomas Street, our client, Paul Sinnott, was a builder contractor who we worked with before, and we had a good trust relationship. So Paul gave me a call to, let's just see, let's try.
It's the arrow right.
Right, where are we? Yeah, that's the one. So that's the first site we had in March 2014. As you can see, a lot of the other speakers have mentioned about these buildings hiding a lot of secrets and looking quite innocuous from the front elevation. As you can see, the building was in pretty poor condition. Paul had bought it, what he thought as a doer-upper, And he got it for a very reasonable price as a result, but you can see why he got it for a very reasonable price. This was the condition of the roof when we arrived at the site, and our first engagement with the City Council was really just to try and find out a little bit more about the house. Paul went in initially just to try and make it safe, really, because there was no point in trying to get past go on this building until the building was safe. I remember Nikki telling me that she stood at the door and said, "Okay, I'm not going any further," because the roof was in such a perilous condition, and that had fed into the entire building. Water had been pouring in for 25 years. There was dry rot, there was wet rot, there was collapse. So this was a building that you would sort of, most cases, you would just write off as a no-hoper. But Paul, being the kind of person he was, just saw it as a challenge, and so we got involved. So that was our first view of the building. And as you can see, the early joinery is evident. A lot of the joinery had been lost, a lot of the joinery had been... The best remnants were on the ground floor, but the staircase survived all the way up the building. But the balustrade had been basically chopped out, literally cut out the further you went up the building, and very likely just used as firewood and lost that way. But we did have very good evidence, as you can see, very nice barley sugar balusters. So our first job was really to try and make the building safe. So initially Paul engaged with his regular engineer, Robert McGrath from Pat O'Gorman and Associates. And Robert went in with a view to try and stabilise the building and to try and prop it. So he did that by basically trying to kind of evolve a system of propping that Paul could use safely and make the building safe, which allowed us to go in. It started off with my colleague Shane O'Connor and myself to go in and basically survey all the joinery. The blue is the surviving timbers that we identified as we went up the building. There was more surviving on the ground floor. There were layers and layers and layers and layers of detritus. The building had been used as a kind of fly tip from above by neighbouring properties. So we had mattresses, and then a lot of the actual areas of interest were hidden behind beauty board. The shop, the building had been a shop, and everything covered in beauty board. Beauty board is the least beautiful thing that you can find. But anyway, so Paul carefully stripped that away, and it allowed us to kind of make those assessments. As you can see, it's an interesting plan. This is the ground floor here, with the sort of where the shop was. At basement level, and then that's at the entry level there. The corner fireplace had been lost at the front, but it was essentially your typical corner fireplace, 2-room with a staircase, and then interesting roof form. It had a kind of a roof and a half at the back, and we quickly kind of could identify by looking at the top floor that it probably was a dormered building originally, with an extra floor was added, and a parapet put in, because we could see the remnants of the pathway of the old roof. So now the roof had been replaced. The very derelict roof you saw in the earlier slide had been replaced. It was all modern cut timbers. It was severely deteriorated, so it wasn't a sort of difficult decision to remove it, but to reinstate it as found. In a sense, we rebuilt the form as found, but with a modern roof. What Paul was able to do then was to kind of support the building, and Robert then we had to look at what we were dealing with. So it was a kind of a structural strategy that we had to adapt and kind of come up with. And I would say that every building that you come up with or you meet is going to tell a different story, and it's going to suggest different things to you. This house had gone so far gone structurally that there was very little viability in any of the structural elements, the floors, the joists, the walls. So we had to try to make a decision: how do we bring this building forward in a way that keeps as much original material as possible? So Robert came up with a very simple system of basically a steel frame that would be inserted into the building, which would allow the building to be supported and allow us the time then to assess what we were dealing with. So it was a kind of an approach that we would build a semi-permanent steel frame, The steel frame was more complex as in the start. It had struts which were designed to be removed as the building became more stable, but we were still working on the basis that we would build a permanent steel frame, because the level of fragility of the surviving fabric was such that if we started to dismantle that, and some of it had already collapsed, but if we started to dismantle it, we were going to be involved essentially in a reconstruction, which was going to lose some of the essence of the building as it was. So the steel frame gave us the flexibility to retain as much original material as possible. That is ground floor plan. As there was a kind of there was a partition across the back, but actually it was modern. And there was a funny little, which actually doesn't show on that plan, there was a little nook that went into the neighbouring building. What we were able to find from blocked up openings that ownership had changed over the years, and this building had been part of neighbouring buildings and connected to them, then blocked up again and then opened up again. So periods of different ownership had provided for a different kind of connectivity between its neighbours. So this is where we were on the top floor then once the steel frame design was worked out. I have to say that all along this process we were very much working with and involved with the City Council and with Nicky's support and Carl Raftery and everybody else in the City Council. It was a kind of a collaborative journey, and doing this kind of project is incredibly collaborative, as I'm sure all of you know. You end up working with so many different people who are bringing so many different skills to the table. Paul was a brilliant client, and I think that's so important that you have a client who's sympathetic to the building. Paul came from a joinery background before he was a main contractor, so he was very interested in the joinery of the building. And he was able to sort of say, I know what I'm dealing with now, and to give us the space with the support of the council. The council was very supportive in terms of encouraging us to go for specific grant aid as well, and that gave Paul that little bit of room financially to sort of allow the building to have the time to be explored and developed in an appropriate way. So we did sections through the staircase. We categorized what was original, what was what was lost, and that was a kind of a very interesting process, and just looking at what we had, and then working with a specialist joiner who was Pat Lynch from McGlynn Joinery, who Paul had worked with before, and then starting to develop a strategy for restoration of the staircase in a way that was kind of going to bring back the character of the staircase. See how I'm doing. So there we were in a situation which was unusual in that all the non-viable structural elements had kind of deflected and settled. So we were able to put in a new floor which was actually to the correct level, but the surviving elements had deflected so much that they became, there was no possibility that we were going to be able to reuse them anyway. The joist ends had rotted quite badly in most cases, but everything was recorded very carefully, and then we were able, once the floor above had been inserted, to place the timbers back from recording exactly where they had been found. This was a point where Robert stood back from the project because he was moving from one practice to another, so it was an opportunity then when we worked then with Lisa Eden, and we knew Lisa's work in Ainger Street and her particular experience and skills with buildings of this period. So we were able to engage with Lisa, who was a fantastic partner on the project and somebody who has such knowledge and appropriate sympathy for a building of this period. So we were able then to evolve ways and strategies that the surviving timbers could be presented in such a way that they were seen as found, and if they were stabilised and presented, they were presented in a clean, clear way. And you'll see in some of the later slides that Lisa evolved very simple ways of just hanging timbers as found. You can see also that there's an original partition which separated the entry corridor from the front room. Now, whilst it was early, it was clearly had been moved at some point because there was no connection between the top and bottom. So it looked as though it was an early partition that had been moved, but we decided to retain it in position. And one of the issues, of course, you come up against then is evolving a strategy for reuse, and we wanted to look at the issue of how this building was going to evolve into an active and viable use. There was a commercial use at ground level, which worked, and there were 2 floors above. And Nikki encouraged us, rather than going for splitting the floors above, to go for a sort of duplex-style apartment, which actually worked very well because it minimised the level of intervention we had to make in terms of fire separation and compliance. But what we did introduce was fire separation between the ground and first floors, which we use the Lamatherm system, which is a very simple system for inserting between joists. And it gives you the flexibility to work with separating floors in a way that respects and can maintain as much fabric as possible. So this is Lisa's very simple approach to where we had surviving timbers, that they were just essentially presented and held in position in a very simple and clean way. And then you can see the new floor went in then above the deflected original floor. We had a very interesting combination of brickwork that surrounded the staircase. And we were fortunate to get advice from Susan Rowntree, who came to the site and met with my colleague Shane O'Connor and started to identify the layers and cumulative changes to the building, identifying the fact that there was brickwork, early brickwork. The thinner early bricks were concentrated in the party walls. And as you went up the building, you began to see more intervention from later rebuilds, later larger bricks being evident. So here we are surveying the staircase, marking with chalk every single element of the staircase. And one of the big surprises we discovered was at the front, the riser was a kind of a moulded riser. And that was a very interesting thing because buildings of this age had a certain architectural ambition, even though they were quite modest buildings. But we were able to kind of correlate these buildings with other buildings where timber staircases aped the architectural detailing of stone staircases. So, and we were able to even discover like a 17th century hammerhead hidden behind one of the staircases. And what Paul did at the end of the project was make a little display case for the tenants. So all the kind of artifacts and remnants are there for the tenants to see and to show off to their friends. So it was a very kind of interesting exploratory process. Working with the council, then we worked also at their suggestion with CRDS. Aisling Collins, who's here today, did a very good report where she set the whole house in its historical archaeological context. It was also driven by the fact that we were going to do some work in the basement, so we wanted to excavate the basement floor where there was a very thin, rather nasty concrete layer on top of the original. So Aisling was able to open that up and to sort of find what was the original construction underneath and if there were any artifacts of interest. So there we have a detail of the balustrade. And it's amazing when you look at these, you sort of think every single one is different. You can just imagine them being turned and then the wood carver having a slightly different view as he was going. Or one day he would put in slightly more twists. So every single one has its own individual character. So the challenge for Pat Lynch was to try and reinstate in a way that was sympathetic to that character and ethos and finding the right timber. So we were also then fortunate to work with Gordon Knaggs, timber specialist, and with David Brown from Queen's University Belfast, who did a lot of research, dendrological and carbon 14 dating. That's a view of the side of the string of the staircase, which is this heavily moulded detail, kind of pulvinated moulding, which is amazingly kind of rich for a building of this relatively modest size and ambition. It's what we call competitive recording. That was Lisa Eden taking a picture of Shane and myself. Shane and then my other colleague, Niamh Kiernan, came on board after Shane went back to Waterford, where he was from, and we worked together on the project, and I think it was a very useful and interesting collaboration. Here we were testing the cleaning process for the timber. What we wanted to do was just basically to do a very light surface clean using chalk and looking at different densities and different levels of cleaning to try and establish the best and most appropriate way of taking away the surface dirt, but essentially consolidating and leaving what we found as much as possible. You can see the Lamatherm system has been inserted. Again, we were lucky that Declan Crilly of FEAC had a very good relationship with the fire officer. So he was able to kind of negotiate a very kind of sympathetic approach in terms of fire treatment. Here's Pat's work in reinstating the treads on the staircase, and where it was lost, he remolded the molded frontispiece to the riser. And then here we are further up the building where Pat had inserted new balusters and new handrails. The newel posts had survived, very simple, chunky newel posts with little mouldings top and bottom, possibly maybe a little altered a little bit later, but surviving. And then it enabled us to reinstate the entire staircase from ground to top floor. We used a Canadian pine, which we established was probably the best. But what was interesting from the dendrological information was that there was a variety of timbers. There was oak as well as pine used in the building. But the testing allowed us to consolidate a date towards 1640. The majority of the tests suggested a date for the staircase of 1640, although we did find a 15th century timber there as well. So again, speaks to the fact that timbers were reused, and there was a bit of creative reuse going on then in terms of sustainability in its 17th century form. Here we are again. This is the most intact original section. We only had to reinstate one missing baluster. So then the building found a new life. This is the view of the staircase. There was a sort of early 19th century treatment of the half landing window, but most of the staircase had been lost, and this is after the reinstatement work. Lisa did great work in kind of stabilizing the staircase and allowing the maximum reuse of the original structure. But obviously it was in a perilous condition, and Lisa's work was very valuable in terms of designing a way of treating it. This is the entry corridor with the planked partition reinstated, but obviously we had to insert a fire wall between that and the new shop to provide for fire separation. And then this is the interior of the apartment on the first floor. There's Paul's little display cabinet for the artifacts found on the site. We've got some very nice old salvage boards for the floors, and you can see the corner fireplace. We've exposed the principal timbers, and I think the building has been allowed to have a viable function. This is an exposed section of the staircase brickwork. As you can see, a variety of repairs, a variety of shapes and sizes. Quite a crude level of construction, but a fascinating kind of accumulation. And here's another view, this time on the top floor. Again, trying to leave remnants of the structure and heritage of the building exposed for the owners to enjoy. And little remnants viewed, exposed in the building. Then the new guys took over. These two young guys who have run a barber shop in the ground floor. One of them started off his life as an architectural technician, so he had a real kind of passion for architecture. So now he's doing hipster beard cuts and all that kind of thing. But actually it's great because it allows people using the shop to really kind of engage with the history of the building. So while they're waiting for their haircut, they're looking up and asking the guys, well, what's all this going on? So it's a kind of active engagement, a building finding a new life, which I think is very useful and appropriate. There's again a little detail inside the shop. I think there's the maximised amount of history, little details, and then that's the new shop front that we applied to the building, trying to keep it as simple and appropriate to the use and form of the building, so that the entry to the apartment is defined and the entry to the shop is defined also. And then there it is, back in from the original slide back to where it is now, a viable living part of Thomas Street. And I think it's been very fascinating to see how Thomas Street, a number of projects have happened since this happened. So it's, one feeds another. People can see that something can be done, and it encourages other owners. We were lucky to have a very sympathetic owner, and not everybody is, but I think it was a fascinating experience I think everybody is learning every day on a job like this, and as I say, collaborative, and a kind of a wonderful project to learn on, and an absolute privilege actually to work on a building like this. So I leave it there.
It just shows what can be done, and that careful stitching within the city is so important. I think Geraldine mentioned earlier about missing teeth. Dentures are no fun, so it's really important. Next speaker is Susan Roundtree. She's a retired conservation architect. I'm sure you all know Susan well, who has practice experience in both the public and the private sectors. She obtained a Master's in Urban and Building Conservation from UCD in 1991 and a Master of Letters by Research in Trinity in 1999 for her research on the history of Irish brickwork. This topic continues to be her area of special interest. She has contributed to a number of publications on building and architectural history and is currently preparing a history of brickmaking in Ireland for publication very shortly, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Nikki, for inviting me to talk today. You've all seen plenty of brick this morning and this afternoon in all those 17th century buildings that we've been looking at, and so it isn't any surprise really that we have brick in 17th century buildings in Ireland from the very beginning of the century. In Dublin, in the administrative records, we have our first reference to brick in the city in 1560. We have our first bricklayer recorded in 1594, and we have our first brickmaker in 1599. So from the very beginning of the 17th century, there is brick, certainly in Dublin and everywhere else really too. My talk today has got a Dublin focus to it, but really there is brick all over the country. We've seen it in other buildings today already. I'm going to talk about brickmaking, the use of brick, identification of brick, and a little bit about importation, and then Sarah Pavia is going to do all the scientific work and tell you more about brick in a particular context. So, okay. So just in terms of the rest of the country, sorry, this is the rest of the country. Mount George Fort on the left-hand side, 1603, the earliest surviving building in Ireland, I think, where you've got substantial walls of brick, so everything above the ground floor is brick and lined with brick inside. In the centre top there, Freddie has already made reference to Rath Church in Killashandra. I've been doing a little bit of work there with Kevin recently, and that's a brick from Killashandra, from the vaulted arch in that church, which is late 17th century date, probably about 1680. The vaults in Jigginstown underneath that from 1637, absolutely fantastic building of brick. And on the right-hand side from Bishop Knox's house in Rathmullen Friary in County Donegal, fantastic star-shaped chimney that I went and visited about 2 weeks ago, so great surprise. When we come to talk about our first brickmaker, George Burroughs granted a lease for 21 years of 4.5 acres to make bricks in the city by the corporation in 1599. The first year's rent was free. He was to supply the city with 60,000 good and well-burnt bricks at 12 shillings 6 pence a thousand, and the lease applied to lands that are more or less in the present-day location of Pearse Street and Delir Street Junction, that area. George Burroughs was admitted as a freeman of the city in 1602 and was still paying rent to the city in 1613, so we know that he was successful in his brickmaking operations. On the right-hand side, you've got a drawing of Trinity College, the Hatfield view from 1591. And as you can see in that, it depicts a garden wall in brick at the front and brick buildings facing onto the square. The Trinity records, as Freddie has mentioned a few of the Trinity buildings already, a lot of references to brick and 17th century building works in Trinity. An account from John Tallis in 1636 for 10 loads of bricks for building in the square. In 1640, articles of agreement for lodgings for the Provost House, works by James Brown and Richard Pavier, bricklayers of Dublin, including chimneys, and the college rubrics, as you probably know, still contain parts of earlier buildings, although they were very significantly altered in the 19th century. And the college had its own brickfield in Westland Row area. There's evidence of brickmakers and bricklayers in Dublin from the beginning of the 17th century, and a list of architects and craftsmen admitted as free men of the city, edited by Dr. Rolf Lober, provides us with some detail about these. I've just put brickmakers here because they're the ones I'm most interested in at the moment. But basically, any tradesman practicing had to have the status of freeman, achieved by birth or marriage, by service or apprenticeship, or by special grace and fines for foreigners. Now, this is probably not a complete list either, because there's a lot of references to how people were practicing without going through the correct procedures. So, but you can see very clearly with the brickmakers that you've got my early fella, George Burroughs, and then another one, and then there's a bit of a jump to 1676, and then it really seems to take off after that. And that seems, to my mind, to represent very much in Dublin, anyway, how things worked, because before 1603, castles, towers, churches, monasteries were built of stone, and in the 17th century, brick was gradually introduced for houses. And there was a survey of chimneys undertaken in 1612. Ruined chimneys were to be rebuilt using stone or brick. But we know that there were brick houses in the city in 1615. A brick house on Hoggan Green is mentioned in a list by Arthur Chichester. In 1617, Sir Richard Boyle, Earl of Cork, purchased a house in Castle Street and a brick house over the street gate. And in 1629, when he was repairing that house, he had bricks specially made for the purpose on lands that were given to him by Lord Caulfield. And Lord Caulfield is a Parliament connection, and we're talking about probably bricks being made at that stage in Marino. So when we're talking about where all this brick was being produced from, the map on the left-hand side is a map of Dublin Bay from 1728, with the River Ear going in that direction. Brick kilns marked on that map in the Clontarf area, so we know that there was a brick making in that area from pretty early on, and certainly well into the 18th century. On the right-hand side, you've got an extract from Roke's map. The location of Merrion Square is there where the top circle is, and you can see where the very first piece of land would have been given to George Burroughs, would have been sort of north of that on the map, and then brickmaking in the Rings End area from 1706, probably earlier, and then of course Sandymount, which was Lord Merion's brickfields, called Brickfield Town, where a huge amount of brick was made in Dublin in the 18th century. There were other brickfields as well. There's a brickfield lane off Cork Street. I think it's probably never found a brick making location in that area, but Brickfield Lane is not called that for no reason. So I think probably quite a lot of brick making on sites generally. That certainly happened in the 18th century. These are just a closer view of the Merrion brickfields. This is from the Pembroke Estate map. This is just one section just to give you an idea of how the Merrion brickfields worked. Each individual tenant had his own sort of plot, and those are numbered and identified within the documentation. But I've just mentioned a few of them there: Michael Donnelly, William Arthur, Gabriel Tyrrell, Caves brickfields and Collins brickfields, and their caves are particularly associated with the Rings End area from the very early 1706 time. Michael Donnelly was a bit later, more like 1750, and Donnelly's bricks are mentioned in quite a few building accounts, including for the first 12 houses in Merrion Square, which includes the RIAI building, and also houses on Sackville Street, the early houses on the Mall. So in terms of buildings, then you've seen this building before, the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham. I was just going to say that the first bricklayer recorded in the city was Richard Feehan, admitted as a freeman in 1594. And between that date, 37 bricklayers were recorded in the city, including John Allen, who was admitted in 1630 and connected with Jigginstown, and James Brown, noted in an account at Trinity College. Increasing reference to brick buildings in the Dublin's administrative records in the 1650s and early Restoration period, a brick house near the Long Stone and Lazy Hill, newly built brick houses in 1659 in Thomas Street and Cook Street, and the City Bakehouse rebuilt in brick in 1660. The Royal Hospital, designed by William Robinson, built between 1680 and 1686, has walls of rubble stone rendered, but originally brick dressings on the east, south and west fronts and string courses. And this Malton view also indicates that the chimneys were brick. At Dublin Castle, Robinson Molyneux building of 1687, part of the south range of the upper yard, was faced with brick. Building in brick continued with Burr Treasury Block, etc. at the castle. I'm just going to read a description of Dublin written by Loveday during his tour of Ireland in June 1732. He highlights how many of the major public buildings in the city in the early 18th century were built of brick. At Chapel Lizard, he mentions the King's House as a brick building. He describes the Deanery House as a late good building of brick, and also notes the use of brick at Marsh's Library, Trinity College and the Castle. He describes the Linen Hall and the Custom House as large buildings of brick, and the Royal Hospital, as we have seen. In post, the Mansion House, I jumped a bit there, haven't I? Sorry, Taylor's Hall, obviously. The Mansion House, 1710, nobody thinks of it as being a brick house, but it very definitely is, before it had a stucco front applied to it in 1850. You've seen this image before. In that post-restoration period, contemporary drawings give us an idea about the appearance of buildings. The gabled house we've heard about earlier on. Houses built of brick and terraces with corner fireplaces. And there are many remnants have been found and are still existing on streets, as we've been listening to today. The late Arthur Gibney suggests many influential people building in Dublin in the early classical period, like Robinson and Mills, had arrived in a great wave of immigrants settling between 1670 and the early 1700s. And the whole introduction of brick facades, gauge brickwork, curvilinear gables, he believes were part of an imported tradition that with time became diluted and mutated. The second wave of classical buildings obviously began in the 1720s, led by Edward Lovell Pearce and the introduction of Palladian architecture. These you've seen before, just a few images of. And this one is 99, St. Stephen's Green, where I think you can see an earlier building in a later facade. So in terms of identifying brick, the size of early 17th century brick in Ireland is acknowledged to be thinner than bricks later in the century, and slightly thinner even than bricks made at the time in England. Brick samples examined from buildings that have been authentically dated are generally about 2 inches deep, whereas bricks made later in the century and in the first half of the 18th century are deeper, between 2 1/4 and 2 1/2 inches. And I think David mentioned this was an interesting feature of the building that he was looking at in Thomas Street. So size can give some guidance at attempting to identify early brickwork, and it does seem to be consistent throughout the country. At Portownah Castle, for example, bricks measuring 8.5 by 4 by 1 3/4 inches were excavated near the building, and slightly larger but thin bricks, 9 by 4 1/4 by 2, found in drainage channels at basement level. Tin bricks have also been found in archaeological excavation at Isolde's Tower in Dublin. and in a wall believed to date from about 1601. So this pile of bricks on the right-hand side, that top one is one that was chopped up by Sarah Pavia in Trinity. It's from Portumna Castle. It's sitting on top of one that came from a building in Castle Street, and that's sitting on top of one that came from Arch Hall in Wilkinstown in County Meath. So you can see that, you know, they're getting deeper as we move along. We didn't have kind of specific, I suppose, building regulation in relation to bricks until Pearse's 1730 Act, and you can see some information there about sizes that are slightly confusing because he specified a longer brick than is normally found in 18th century buildings. Just an example here, this is from the rear of 31 Thomas Street, a building that I looked at, an interesting example of a building of unknown date really, but there was a mixture in that building of later brick and earlier brick, and random bonding, which is another thing when you're looking at brickwork. I suppose it seemed to be very uncoordinated in terms of its bonding, and this is a kind of a shallow brick that came or was there in that building. Just to finish on importation, the types of handmade brick used were either facing bricks or stock bricks and place brick. Place brick is found all over Ireland in buildings and made locally. Facing brick more likely to have been imported, but in very small quantities. Official records for importation began in 1698, and in that year and in 1699, just 2,000 bricks were imported to Dublin. If the official brick import figures for the entire country are considered in the context of what they might have built in each year between 1700 and 1749, it becomes very clear that the quantities of brick imported were very modest. No bricks were imported in 4 of those years, and in only 8 years was more brick imported than would have been required to build a single house, and this amount for the entire country. So the evidence of local manufacture, I think, is very persuasive here. That the importation of brick to Ireland was not significant, at least in these years, is also supported by the fact that Arthur Dobbs's essay of 1729 makes no mention of it, despite the fact that he gives detailed accounts of merchandise imported between 1710 and 1725. The sources of imported brick in the first half of the 18th century were Holland and Great Britain, with more brick imported from Holland into Cork than into Dublin. This is just an example from Bishop's Palace in Limerick City, where you can see that the brick in the head over this window is a slightly different colour and appearance to the brick in the main walls of the house. So if there was imported brick being used, I think it was used very much in those kind of specific areas, possibly for facades, but very sparingly. And this is just a detail from the Fades Mansion building that Sarah is going to be talking about. You can see here that the brick that's used for that purpose over the flat arch head is the same material as in the main walling brick on the right-hand side. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Pavia, Associate Professor of Civil Structure and Engineering in Trinity College Dublin, and a conservator by training and professional expertise. In 2013, Zara was made a Fellow of Trinity College, having been a research fellow at Gobierno de la Rioja in Spain in 1987. Sarah runs and manages Trinity College's Applied Diploma in Building Conservation, which runs as an MA. And Sarah's going to talk about the research that she did in the brick facade of Fades Mansion on Thomas Street, which Nicky Matthews knew was significant and investigated at great length. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Sorry, do you have a pointer or a stick or something?
It's not working your face there.
Okay.
Would you like that?
It's for the screen, it's okay. Oh yeah, but that's too, I was looking at how it's okay. I just pointed it out. Thank you. Just in case. So, good afternoon. First, thank you, Nick, Margaret, Nikki, and Margaret for inviting me to speak today. So, Faith Mansion, again, another building from Thomas Street. And according to the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, it was built in the 1700s as a home to a wealthy man, Joseph Faith. It was renovated in the 1930s, and at that time it was probably rendered, and in 2018 it was to be restored to become part of the student accommodation. So Margaret King commissioned a study of the original materials, so that not only to find out about the materials, but to maybe assist with decisions regarding conservation and refurbishment. So the objectives were to study the composition and to see what was the sources and the fabrication technology of bricks and mortars used to build Faith Mansion and a structure at the back. So the elevation, the facade of Faith Mansion by Cremins architects who were working there on the site as well. And it was clear that there were three different types of mortar on the building. So the first and most abundant, you can see it on the right, binding the brick in Flemish bond. These mortars were scored. So all the way along the facade, there were these thin lines that scores on these mortars. So on further visits and on further inspection, it was found that there was a few remains of Wiggin mortars. You can see them in there. There was only a few places where these mortars were still in place. So we could see that there was a very fine mortar that was placed over the brick face and locked in the grooves of the joints and painted in red. They were dyed in red, and then a white joint was painted on top of it. So that was the second type of mortars. And the third type, the ones that Susan just showed, were at the window heads. The window heads were finished in these flat arches with central stone keys that seem to be Portland stone. So here the voussoirs were cut so that the arch could be formed with very, very thin joints, only 2 to 5 millimeters. You can see the difference between the scored joints, the main mortars in the walls, and these really thin joints. So, as we know, this type of detailing, sort of superior detailing, is called gauged brickwork, and these guys we call rubbers or rubbing bricks. They usually they were fired at lower temperatures so that they could be cut in shapes to be able to build these thin joints. So the weathering, they are very intensely weathered in most of the window heads. You can see some detail on the right. So this intense weathering and the presence of lamination and other features of this brick would agree with lower firing temperatures. But anyway, I'll come back to that later on. This is the structure at the back that we also looked at. The fabric was completely different than the facades. There were larger bricks in general, but some of them were much thinner, not as deep. But they were very uneven, and the window heads were rough arches with very thick joints. So some of them were actually finished, I'll come back to this now, some of the window heads were finished in 2 half-brick rings to avoid the very thick joints, but still very thick joints, very inconsistent bond, like Susan mentioned just now, headers followed by stretching in the same course, then different courses alternating, so it was quite a very different fabric altogether. Paul Duffy, who was the director of the archaeological excavation, showed me this map, this drawing that is now lost, that I think it appeared published in a paper by Clark, dating from the 70s. And in this, he brought me the attention to me that in this drawing, there was the window shapes were similar, and their positions relative to the doors and between each other were quite. You can identify similarities between the two, and so this seems like it will be an earlier structure. So the mortars then, I'll just take first the pointing and bedding, the main brickwork, the ones that were scored that you can see there. So they were more or less fine. There was only very rare coarse aggregate in them. The composition of the sand, the fine aggregate with calpstone, chert, limestone, granite, some finer quartz. All these compositions, they really suggest that the aggregate was a local sand. So, but the most interesting part of these mortars, I suppose, is the presence of gypsum. Gypsum is a calcium sulfate, and gypsum was present in two forms, well, in three forms. As aggregates, in grays, you can see one of them here, and as gypsum rock, burnt gypsum rock. You can see some fragments of burnt gypsum rock there, some in there. So in these two different forms. So finding gypsum is not that common in external masonry mortars in Dublin. But the X-ray pattern also pointed out the presence of gypsum. It was quite clear. And also when looking at the binder very closely, you could see that not only there was carbonated lime, but also gypsum in the binder quite clearly. So, second type of mortars, the wigging mortars, they were completely different, and they were they had aggregate, and the aggregate was very, very fine, quite abundant, and very homogeneous in composition. It was basically quartz, mostly quartz sand, silica sand. So the binder was carbonated lime, microcrystalline calcium carbonate, with very little fracturing, and there was a lot of accumulations which had no retraction cracks, which means basically that they could have been gypsum as well in these mortars. But looking at the X-ray diffraction pattern, we didn't find any gypsum. What we found was a double carbonate of lead, which basically was, what it's telling us is that this white paint that was used to paint the joints over the wigging was a lead paint, because this double carbonate, hydrocerusides, it was one of the white pigments, the main source of whites. Historically, one of the main ones was this carbonate. So what else did we find in the wigging? Oh yeah, there was a sequence of surfaces, in some places at least 3, and there were just carbonated surfaces. I don't know whether they were lime-based paints or maybe lime washes. What it was clear is that the wigging mortars were painted with some iron-based paint. So there was a lot of oxides. You can see the red, and if you look at even a higher magnification, there was a lot of crystals of oxides on these coatings. The robin bricks, the mortar binding the robin brick, it was again completely different. This one had no sand. That was the most amazing. It had no aggregate, no sand. It was pure binder, and whatever. The only thing you could find now and then was occasional fragments of partially burned gypsum rock. So again, gypsum mortars externally. At higher magnification, you could see mixes of gypsum with some calcium carbonate and some oxides are mixed together. And at higher magnifications, you can see that the gypsum was present in several ways, in different forms. That's normal because gypsum is a sulfate, which takes a lot of moisture and changes into other crystal habits. So that's quite common for gypsum. So here you can see the gypsum mixed with lime in the binder, with carbonated lime in the binder. And as I said, you could see the gypsum only a very high magnification, but with different habits, like skeletal, fibrous, hexahedral. It means basically as fibers, as square grains, in different shapes, basically. That's what I mean. The X-ray diffraction trace again pointed out the presence of gypsum. I didn't want to believe that there was gypsum in there, so I kept running the X-ray to make sure that. Okay, so the mortars were quite straightforward, but the bricks were not very straightforward. I was there for a few times on the sites, and I kept taking bricks because as the restoration works were going on, it was great because I could pretty much take many as possible. But then I was filling my living room with bricks, and I was thinking, oh my god. So I decided I have to make a sort of pre-selection based on the presence of cinders, the presence of black core. You can see the little cinders. The different varying hardness and different conditions. Some of them were in very good condition, others were not in very good condition. The lamination, the presence of pebbles and coarse sand, and the color. So taking all that into account and staring at them and staring for hours, then I made this pre-selection that you can see in there. And then we started the study. So according to the X-ray, well, not only to the X-ray, but to the observations that I'm going to show you later on with the microscope, we could split the bricks in three different groups. Low temperature, medium high, and higher. So the lower temperature bricks, which I believe would have reached 800, sometimes less temperature, we can say that because of the presence of clay. Clay is still present, and some carbonate which can be inherited from the sediment, because this carbonate only breaks up over, it's like lime. You need to heat that up at 900 degrees or over 900 degrees to break this down. So the presence of that and clay means that the bricks didn't reach a certain temperature. That because of the presence of this allied clay, I think it was about 800. We found some secondary phases, sulfates and other, but these are secondary due to exposure over time. So as we increase the temperature, the clay disappears, upgrades into mica, and then we start finding out phases such as spinel and some more feldspar and more hematite, iron oxide, that they have been creating as the temperature increased. So the top temperature bricks, they had no hematite because the iron has been converted into high temperature oxides, magnetite and spinel, together with the aluminium in the clay and the micas. There is not even some feldspar anymore, and then we have high temperature silica, like tridymite crystallite. It's just quartz. If you apply temperature to silica, you get quartz, and then higher temperatures, you get these two guys. So high temperature silicates, such as these non-cordiarites, and these type of minerals would only appear at temperatures over 1200, nearly 1300 degrees. So these are the three groups. But as I said, not only the X-ray identification of the different mineral phases, but also taking the petrography of bricks, such as this one from the facade and that BC from the back wall. You can see, for example, granite fragments where the feldspar, parts of the granite, has transformed into higher temperature silicates. Also quartz, sedimentary quartz, relics of quartz partially transformed. You can see all this grow of, this is a new phase that has been growing during firing. So in these high temperature bricks, the matrices were typically very black. All this black stuff is glass. It has no crystalline structure, so in the microscope it looks completely black. And also some new formed crystals. All these wiggly sort of crystals, wiggly faces were new formed during firing. So that was a typical matrix of one of the high temperature, some of these high temperature bricks. At lower magnification, you could see that alternation, areas of opaque glass alternating with less glassy areas, with more new formation. You could see the fragments of limestone sometimes, some other times granites or sandstones in there, residual. And we could see that micas were breaking down and being transformed into glass meaning that the temperature has to be more than 1050 degrees Celsius for the micas to break down like that. With the petrographic microscope will give us two-dimensional pictures of the material at not very high magnifications. You can see the scales in the previous pictures. But the SEM, scanning electron microscope, will give us a three-dimensional black and white picture at much higher magnification. But really what we could see sort of was very much on the same thing that with the petrographic microscope. Only we could see the glass much better, and we could take the composition of the glass. So we have transitions between areas with discontinuous glass and very little new formation, into other areas where we have glass completely covering all the material. And the highest temperature was reached by areas that will look like some coalescent glass with bloating pores. Bloating pores indicate extensive melting, because bloating pore is like when you boil water and the bubbles. So imagine that you are boiling a solid and you have the bubbles that the melt will leave. So we could find that in the cinders, in the areas near black core, in all these areas. And that a picture of one of these highest temperature areas under the petrographic microscope will look like that. With the bloating pores, a lot of glass and some relics of material, sedimentary material, with a lot of transformation. So the lowest temperature bricks. The guys that reach less temperature, the microscope will show an open structure completely different, with only occasional glass and a lot of pores and many grains that will look more like sedimentary materials. And also secondary phases, sulfates and some carbonates that I'm not sure whether they were secondary, and sometimes relics of the original sediments. So with the petrographic microscope you find sort of the same type of reaction. You'll find large grains from the original sediment that was used to make the bricks, and some silt graded and sand graded minerals and rock fragments. Some of them will show some reaction. For example, this is a large chert, which is typical, as you know, of the calc limestone. In the Dublin area we find a lot of chert. It's microcrystalline silica, where you see that there is a reaction ring. It's typical. Well, all the oxides have been depleted from this rim and have formed inside. So this indicates a certain amount of transformation, a certain temperature, but you can still the abundant silt-graded quartz, the abundant sand, and some glass, but not very linked in different layers. So conclusions. With respect to the mortars, all the mortars, I think, they were lime-based mainly, but contained gypsum. So gypsum, as I said, is a calcium sulfate. As you've seen, the aggregate was very different. So the three different mortars were very different. So it is very unusual to find gypsum in exterior masonry in Ireland, and it's because of the fact that gypsum is hygroscopic. It absorbs ambient humidity and is quite soluble in water. For example, we can dissolve 2,000 milligrams per liter of calcium sulfate in water, whereas we can only dissolve 80 milligrams if we have a calcium carbonate. That's at ambient temperature. So a mix of very hygroscopic, taking water, releasing water, and quite soluble. So it wasn't really used in our lab. That's what I thought. Obviously, I wasn't very right, because these were basically used originally and they were not protected. Otherwise, the wigging wouldn't have been there. The wigging was obviously, the facade was on show. So they were not even rendered for protection or anything. And yet they are there and they have survived, they've done their function. They are now sometimes detached, but they are still keeping quite very healthy, I would say. So why did the masons use gypsum? Well, there is two main reasons. First, gypsum has no retraction. It doesn't reduce volume on hardening. So using gypsum allowed the masons to produce very fine, nearly pure binders in the case of the rubbing mortars, with just not using any sand. So, second, gypsum is hydraulic. It hardens it sets very quickly. So that would have allowed them to get a bond with the masonry units very quickly, without waiting really. So I think that's the reasons why they used gypsum anyway. And the conclusions in relation to the brick, I think the origin is local. As Susan said, a lot of locally made brick in Ireland, all over. I think that's no exception. I think the raw material, taking into account the mineral assemblage that I show you with X-ray diffraction, the presence of occasional lamination, which is really a remnant of the sediment, and the presence of pebbles, coarse sand, some gravel, and the mineralogy of the inclusions inside the clay, inside the bricks. I think the raw material was probably originally a till, a boulder clay with some alluvium influence, because it wasn't very rough. It was basically a lot of clay in it, so it wasn't a real hard ice sediment. It had some, I think, alluvium influence. So that makes sense also because, as you know, boulder clays are very common in Dublin, and also the location of the site is the first terrace of the River Liffey. So I want to talk to Susan later on to see if you have identified any brickworks around the neighborhood. But anyway, that's my thoughts. And with respect to firing, top temperatures of 1300, indicated by all the sintering and the new formation that I showed you before. Now it can be overestimated because we have calcium, we have limestone pebbles in the bricks from now and then, and there is some calcium in them. And there is also some alkalis, sodium and potassium, and these guys, they lower the melting temperatures. They are what we call fluxes in chemistry. So the black cinders, they were probably added. Now, many of the bricks, they don't have any cinders and they are quite clean, but some of them do. And I don't really know why, I know in some cases this type of fuel was added to lower fire, to enable firing faster, and of course spend less fuel. But I don't know, there is only a few bricks that have cinders. I found that before in other bricks, so it was common in the historic brick making. The constant presence of hematite. Now, I was thinking what was it, clamps, was it control firing operation? I think it was control because, as you can see, most of the bricks are red, orange, so it means that hematite was oxidized during the whole brick making process. You can see in the X-ray diffraction table there was hematite, all of the bricks have hematite. So that means that the firing atmosphere was controlled, and you can only control the firing atmosphere if you use kilns. Also, there was a lot of bricks that were in very good condition, so a lot of bricks got quite high firing temperatures, otherwise they wouldn't have been as damaged as the rubbers. And the black cord, the scum and reduction marks were very occasional, so it was good quality brick. And finally, the rubbers, they were probably fired at low temperature, and as we said before, and the brick damage is due to a combination of not only exposure, but also occasional low firing temperatures, the presence of pebbles, some of which were limestone, which will expand later on hydration when they are exposed, and sometimes a low clay mineral, a lot of sand, which means less bonding. In the back wall, as I mentioned before, it seems to be an earlier structure. But I think the bricks were probably made with a similar raw material, comparable firing method as well. A lot of red shades, a lot of hematite all the time, and very similar features to the Fate Mansion. But the sizes are, and the brick sizes and the wall fabric, they suggest maybe a more rudimentary building technology. But in contrast, the raw material seems finer. There is less gravel and less. But however, I didn't really see enough bricks. By the time I got to the site, there was a lot of scaffolding, and I really didn't take many bricks on that side. So I don't really know about that, and I leave it to your own decision. Thank you.
Where's Graham? There he is. Our next speaker is Michael O'Boyle. Michael O'Boyle is a Grade 1 conservation architect and a director of Blewett O'Donoghue Architects with offices in Kilkenny and Dublin. He works on a wide range of conservation projects and has recently completed work on 5 courthouse buildings in Cork, Limerick, Mullingar, Waterford and Wexford. Michael's work on pre-1700 buildings includes Feathered Thalsall, Kilkenny Courthouse, the Hole in the Wall in Kilkenny and Roath House in Kilkenny, all of which involved close collaboration with archaeologists. Michael is a trustee of the Irish Landmark Trust and of the Buildings of Ireland Charitable Trust, and he's a former member of the Architecture Committee of the Heritage Council. He's a consultant conservation architect to Tipperary Council. And he's going to talk to us about revealing early buildings in Bandon and Feathered.
I'm going to be as quick as I possibly can because the coffee break beckons. So I have 4 very brief headings. An introduction just to give you a little bit of background as to my route into this topic. Then 2 buildings that I looked at, the Everard Arms House in Feathered and North Main Street in Bandon, and then a couple of concluding comments. So we'll crack on. So, introduction. I've been working in conservation, I suppose, right back to my earliest time in college as a student. And these are some of the earliest photographs I took when I was in UCD studying architecture. And these are October 1983, recording a visit to Roath House for a student project. It was my first time ever going to Kilkenny, and this was the building we went to look at, and the building and the city came back to me in later life. I was lucky enough to be involved in working with the Roath House Trust in implementing aspects of the conservation plan, re-establishing the garden on the former OPW depot site, working with a team including Nessa Roach from the department, and involvement from the OPW as well, an expert team. And then also dealing with the reinvention of the third house, which brought me into contact with stone corbels, oak beams, wood mouldings on windows, heavy chimneys, all the characteristics of late 17th century architecture, or sorry, late 16th century architecture. And simultaneously, up the street in High Street, working on the Hole in the Wall, which is part of the Archer Mansion, which dates from about 10 years prior to the construction of Roath House. Rose Archer married John Roath, so the 2 families were linked together. And this again is a significant survival with all of the same sort of features that I was encountering in Roath House. And these were the 2 that I was most heavily involved in. But we have an office in Kilkenny. I do a lot of work in Kilkenny. I've been very lucky to be let loose, I suppose, on some of Kilkenny's nicest buildings. And all the time when you go in through the front door of any building on the high street, you're aware that you might find a Tudor fireplace, an early post-medieval door. You're constantly looking for these little clues. This is the interior of the Hole in the Wall, and you can see again the Elizabethan fireplace there, and some of these other features that we were seeing this morning. My work in Dublin has brought me into contact with early 18th century buildings. I worked on a pair of houses in Montpellier Hill, badly fire damaged, badly damaged in a whole heap of ways, but corner fireplaces, the downstand beams,
supporting the floor joists, all characteristic of early 18th century house building. And interestingly, although I don't have it in this slide, relative to Niall Crimmon's presentation in the morning, this building had a panelled timber wall which was structurally supporting the staircase. So looking, I suppose, over the course of my career, I've been very aware that one needs to be looking out for these clues, and if something strikes you as being not quite right, you have to follow your instinct and begin to explore and get to the bottom of it, because all is not always as it seems. So that's the introduction and the preamble. Moving on to the first of the two buildings, which is the Everard Arms House in Fethard, which was constructed in 1710, I beg your pardon, 1710, I think I have the date. Sorry, 1610, I beg your pardon. And this appeared earlier in Valerie Mulvan's slide very briefly as the fire station. It was constructed as an almshouse by the Everards, who were a very wealthy family within the walled town of Fethard. It subsequently, in the 18th century, became the town hall, therefore locally known as the Falsel. Then it became a market house, then it became a fire station, and more recently it's become a museum, which we'll get to in a minute. So I suppose my impressions of Fethard, I mean, Jean Farrelly gave a very good introduction to the town this morning, but you drive through the main street and it feels like a Victorian main street with very fine late 18th century, early 19th century houses and shop fronts, etc. And then you drive around the back down where the river frontage is, and you see this sort of wonderland of the walled town and the fortifications of the Holy Trinity Church, all of which you don't get any sense of from the main street in Fethard, with the exception of this building, which sort of bridges the gap and sort of pokes its nose through on the street frontage and sort of signals that there's more going on. I think when you're looking at a town like Fethard and you're looking at the buildings, you begin to go back through the old photographs and you see this played host to various events. The visit of, I think, President Mary Robinson in the early 1990s is this image on the left-hand side. And then the cyclists that's also in the background. And you can see sort of one half of it there to the left has been sort of given a late 19th century makeover, and then some cyclists in the front. And the building was also associated with the foundation of the Irish Country Market Association. So a lot of history. And then I was asked by Tipperary County Council to do a study of the building. It followed a number of previous studies, and it was really to identify how the building could be reused. So I was very clear that for me to take this on, I had to come with a sort of a suggestion as to how the building could be reimagined. So the first thing was to look at the features, and there were a number of early 17th century features. As you can see, the rainwater spout, from Roath House. This was a very important feature in Roath House, and the collection of rainwater into a cistern under the ground in the second courthouse in Roath House was something I was very familiar with. The cut limestone chimney, the double window with the hood mouldings, these are all very typical of what I would have been seeing in my work in Kilkenny. And then the 18th century alterations, the central slide is of a grand staircase which was added on at the back of the building leading up to the first floor, which then became the council chamber during its time as the town hall. The more typical 18th century rectangular windows and the introduction of an arched opening. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one side of the building got a sort of a late 19th century makeover and became a sort of a ground floor shop unit with a residence on the upper floor. So you're beginning to see cast iron fireplaces and 19th century staircases. And the challenge then is how to begin to look at each of these elements, weigh up significance, and begin to come up with a strategy to represent the building. We were fortunate to have this photograph of when the render was stripped from the building in the late 1980s, and one can see there are remnants of earlier windows there. The proportions of the gable in the centre always struck me as slightly odd.
and it was pretty obvious to me that there would have been a parapet on either side of that sort of vertical upstand where the gable is. I spent a lot of time trying to play around with the pixelation on this image and get in closer to see could I see anything further. In particular to see could I see anything to the right and left of the gable, but the pixels broke down and defeated me. But fortunately, because it was re-rendered in the 1990s, we had to remove what was cement render, and I got a chance to investigate up close and personal. So the feasibility study recommended some essential repairs, removal of a 1950s toilet block, which was causing dry rot and water ingress, which is the yellow rectangle. And then some very basic parameters for redevelopment. The key one being this green route through that you could go 6 steps, which is the length of an oak beam, 6 very long steps maybe, but through the building, and you get presented with the view of the walled townscape to the rear. And that was very, very important, maintaining that view. And I fought hard over the course of the project on that front. And then there was an opportunity to perhaps get a terrace in to allow an external outdoor view across into the grounds of Holy Trinity Church. So these were very, very rudimentary sketches that I did at the outset in the feasibility report. And I was also suggesting that there must have been a gable at the back if there was a gable at the front, and that's what that little slide was about. That gable didn't exist at the time. The project, I lost contact with the project for a while, and planning was achieved, and a shout out for Gráinne Shaffrey, who handled that element of the project. And then suddenly, by a circuitous route, I came back in again through the joys of public procurement. And the first stage was to begin to refurbish the main building, which involved a certain amount of strip out. And I was fairly sure we would find something on this gable wall, and sure enough, out came the early 17th century fireplace.